Chapter 22, The Great Depression and the New Deal, 1929 to 1939. Individual choices, Francis Perkins. On February 22, 1933, President-elect Franklin D. Roosevelt asked Frances Perkins to be Secretary of Labor. Trained as a social worker, Perkins had been deeply affected by the Triangle Shirtwaist tragedy in 1911. She had worked long and hard with the social justice ideals that Jane Addams, remember her from the Settlement House movement, had written into the 1912 Progressive Party platform, and she had served as head of the state labor department when Roosevelt was governor of New York. She agreed to Roosevelt's offer of a cabinet job only if she could push for social justice legislation, including relief for the unemployed, old age pensions, a minimum wage, and abolition of child labor. Roosevelt agreed. He warned that she should not expect too much help from him, but also suggested that she nag me about this forever. She accepted, becoming the first woman to serve in a president's cabinet. Perkins proved to be more tireless advocate than nag, giving strong support to the first federal relief programs for the unemployed. She also set out to create a system of social insurance, including unemployment compensation, pensions for elderly workers, aid to dependent children, and assistance for mothers and children. To secure passage of the Social Security Act of 1935, however, Perkins had to compromise. See the individual voices featured at the end of this chapter. For fiscal and political reasons, the final bill required workers to pay into the system instead of having benefits paid out of taxes. Perkins had also wanted medical coverage, but it was excluded. After many speeches and countless congressional committee hearings, the bill passed, and the relationship between the federal government and the people fundamentally changed. Next, Perkins turned to federal standards for workers' wages and hours of work. No self-supporting and self-respecting democracy, she argued, could justify any economic reason for chiseling workers' wages or stretching workers' hours. The Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938 addressed these concerns that also barred industrial child labor. Shortly before Perkins left office in 1945, Collier's did a story on her accomplishments and concluded that the previous 12 years were not so much the Roosevelt New Deal as the Perkins New Deal. In 1929, the stock market crashed and the economy plunged into a deep depression. President Herbert Hoover fought the economic collapse with new policies, but he failed to produce recovery. In 1932, amid high unemployment and spreading bank failures, Franklin D. Roosevelt was elected president. He proved willing to expand the federal government significantly to combat the Depression. The New Deal, however, raised serious questions both then and since. Should the government promote human rights over property rights? Should it assist the disadvantaged by taxing the wealthy? How should the Constitution be applied to circumstances unforeseen when it was written? By its response to these questions, the New Deal set the agenda for many of the nation's political, economic, and social debates from then to now. The economic crisis, considering the questions, how did the stock market crash affect the American economy, and what economic weaknesses contributed to the crash in the Great Depression? And how did Hoover try to deal with the Depression, and how successful were his efforts? Campaigning for the presidency in 1928, Herbert Hoover had promised a new day for America, but his sweeping victory was more a vote for the status quo. When people vote for Hoover, they vote for Hoover because Republicanism has been working for the last 8 years. The 1920s is a decade of Republican ascendancy in the Oval Office, and voters in 1928, they really want more of the same. The US had experienced almost a decade of economic growth, and people voted for Hoover expecting that trend to continue. The outcome was much different, to say the least. The crash and the Great Depression. Hoover took office as president in the midst of rising stock prices, shiny new cars, and rapidly expanding suburbs that seemed to verify his observation about the final triumph over poverty. But behind the rush for homes, radios, and vacuum cleaners were serious economic weaknesses, some already becoming visible. Less than 8 months after Hoover took office, on Black Thursday, October 24th, 1929, the stock market crashed. As stock prices plummeted, frenzied brokers rushed to place sell orders. Few places were untouched. In the mid-Atlantic, on board the passenger liner Berengaria, Helena Rubinstein learned her stocks had declined by more than $1 million in a few hours. The market rebounded a bit on Friday, but crashed again on Monday. The next day, Black Tuesday, prices plunged again and continued to fall throughout the year. Within the first week of the crash, stocks fell by a total of $30 billion, which is equivalent to about $406 billion today, a decline of about 30%. Thousands of speculators were ruined. Nationwide, the suicide rate increased by almost 50% in 1929 as compared to the previous 8 years, and stories circulated of New York hotel clerks asking guests whether they wanted rooms for sleeping or for jumping. The Dow Jones Industrial Average measures the stock market performance of selected major stocks. From a high point of 381.17 on September 3rd, 1929, the Dow fell to 41.22 on July 8th, 1932, a decline of nearly 90%. Similar losses occurred in stock markets around the world. The Dow did not recover to pre-1929 levels until the 1950s. The crash set off the Great Depression, but it was a catalyst. It was not the cause. And that is something that students always kind of assume, oh, well, the crash caused the Great Depression. It's an ingredient and it's a catalyst according to the book, but it's not like the sole cause here. The Depression resulted from uneven economic growth, overproduction, a skewed distribution of income, meaning a big wealth gap, excessive credit buying, and a credit crunch resulting from serious weaknesses in the banking system. The prosperity of the 1920s had in part rested on expanding industries, especially construction, automobiles, movies, and electronics, that pushed the rest of the economy forward. By 1927, those industries were slowing down. Construction starts, for example, fell from 11 billion to 9 billion units between 1926 and 1929, causing producers of household merchandise to reduce production. The expansion of the 1920s had been uneven. Older industries, including railroads, textiles, and iron and steel, had barely made a profit, while mining suffered steady losses. Workers in those industries saw little increase in wages or standards of living. The economic expansion of the 1920s completely bypassed agriculture, and farm incomes and farm property values fell to about half of their wartime highs. Compounding these problems, so making these problems worse, credit had virtually dried up in rural America, as 5,000 banks, many in rural areas, closed between 1921 and 1928. By the end of 1928, thousands had left their farms, and agriculture was approaching a crisis. Another weakness of the economy lay in the skewed distribution of wealth. In 1929, the richest 5% of Americans received about a third of all income, much of it as interest, dividends, and rent. Given the amount of wealth in the hands of those few, reductions in consumer spending or investment by the wealthy could have a disproportionate effect on the entire economy. Much of the $30 billion loss in stock values represented losses for the wealthiest. The distribution of wealth affected consumer spending in other ways as well. In the late 1920s, the Brookings Institution judged that an annual salary of $2,500 provided an American family a comfortable standard of living. It also found that 70% of American families earned less than that amount. When Hoover took office, many people were buying on credit, especially through installment buying. Americans had used credit that way to borrow $100 million by 1919, but 10 years later, that amount had soared to over $7 billion with a B. Still, few worried so long as the economy seemed stable, unemployment remained low, and most Americans had confidence in the economy. All of that changed with the stock market crash. The stock market crash undermined economic confidence and highlighted the weaknesses of the economy. Where the soaring stock market had symbolized a vigorous economy, the market's continued fall made investors and business leaders wary. Reduced demand led manufacturers to cut production and lay off workers or reduce hours. As more and more people found themselves out of work or with smaller paychecks, they cut back consumer purchases and stopped buying on credit, further reducing demand. When families could not make their installment payments, they lost their car, they lost their radio, and the person who was expecting to get paid back didn't get paid back. As the economy spiraled downward, the banking system appeared to be collapsing. Many banks had made risky loans and now found they could not collect on them. As rumors circulated of a bank's instability, customers would line up at teller windows to empty their accounts. As such runs on banks intensified, more and more banks were unable to meet their obligations, declared bankruptcy, and closed their doors. Thousands lost their savings, a shock that jarred many upper and middle class families. Imagine that. You put your money in the bank closes, and your money is gone. That doesn't happen to us nowadays. And one of the reasons that doesn't happen to us nowadays is because of the FDIC, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, which came around during the New Deal in response to it happening here in the 1920s, 1930s. The Great Depression impacts us to this day. The New Deal is certainly with us in many ways, and the FDIC is one big one that we'll be discussing here shortly. As some banks closed their doors and others struggled to remain open, the nation entered a credit crunch. Unable to collect on many of their current loans, bankers became reluctant to make new loans and credit dried up. In the midst of this, the Federal Reserve raised interest rates, which further discouraged borrowing. Many Americans dumped their stocks for whatever they could get and refused to invest in stocks so long as the market kept falling. Because economic growth and expansion require access to credit from banks and funds from sale of stocks, the entire economy lurched toward paralysis. By 1933, American exports were at their lowest since 1905. Nearly 90,000 businesses had failed, and corporate profits were down 60%. Unemployment rose from 3% in 1929 to 9% in 1930 and 25% in 1933, with much higher rates in manufacturing. That national average of 25%, it obscures areas of much higher unemployment and also areas of much lower unemployment. There are some cities that have up to 75 or 80% unemployment and others that barely have 5 to 10%. So just be aware that a national average like that might not be the most useful statistic. In Gary, Indiana, for example, nearly all wage earners were out of a job. 9,000 banks had closed nationwide, with depositors losing $2.5 billion. The drastic decline in the value of stocks, the bank failures, and actions by the Federal Reserve contributed to a serious shrinkage in the money supply, causing deflation. Average annual family income dropped 35% from $2,300 to $1,500 by 1933. Prices for most products also fell, reducing income to merchants and producers, but the decline in income and uncertainties about the overall economy meant that people were unable or unwilling to buy even at reduced prices. Automobile purchases dropped by 75%. Other industrial nations also experienced economic contraction and significant unemployment. During the 1920s, the European economy was recovering from the devastation of the Great War, greatly aided by over $5.1 billion borrowed from American sources. However, by the end of 1928, American investors began reducing their loans to Europe. The onset of the Depression in the United States worsened the international credit contraction. As the Depression spread, many nations, including the US, raised tariffs to protect their industries from foreign goods. The 1930 Smoot-Hawley tariff, also called Hawley-Smoot, set the highest tariff rates in US history. Such actions were intended to protect domestic markets, but they undermined world trade, including American exports. World trade slowed to a crawl by 1931. Basically, after Smoot-Hawley or Hawley-Smoot, this historically high tariff, other nations will enact their own tariffs or taxes against American goods. So now even fewer people are purchasing American goods overseas. That's shrinking, obviously, American business as well. This sort of sets off a trade war in a sense. It matters today, preventing another Great Depression. In September 2008, major financial institutions faced bankruptcy owing to unwise loans. Panic swept through financial markets. 15 banks failed, and the stock markets crashed throughout the month of October, recording some of the greatest losses ever. Benjamin Bernanke was chairman of the Federal Reserve System. A former economics professor, Bernanke had previously researched the causes of the Great Depression. The key factor he had concluded had been the failure of the Federal Reserve to stop bank failures and to maintain credit. So in 2008, when banks began to fail and the stock market crashed, Bernanke moved quickly and worked closely with Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson to prevent some bank failures and to secure hundreds of billions of dollars of federal loans and investments in key financial institutions to keep them stable and to discourage a credit crunch that could lead to another Great Depression. Kind of cool to see somebody learning from history, isn't it? Hoover's response to the crisis. At first, the most common response to the plunge in stock prices was that voiced by Secretary of the Treasury Andrew Mellon, who stated that the economy remained strong, that the market plunge was temporary, and that it would actually strengthen the economy. Though many experts argued that the free market system would eventually heal itself, Hoover summoned the nation's corporate leaders and asked them to reduce profits rather than to cut jobs and wages. At the same time, he tried to stimulate the economy by urging Congress, states, and cities to spend more on public works projects, including government buildings and highways. Hoover also called on local groups to contribute to help the unemployed. The Agricultural Marketing Act 1929 tried to address farmers' problems by creating a farm board to help support agricultural prices. Despite some initial successes, these failures did little to counteract the credit crunch and produced no sustained recovery. As demand dried up, businesses cut production, reduced wages, and laid off workers. Agricultural prices continued to collapse. State, local, and private efforts to aid the unemployed were overwhelmed by the huge and growing numbers. As the country slipped deeper into depression, Hoover took new steps, some of which finally addressed the credit crunch. He eventually asked Congress for banking reforms, support for home mortgages, creation of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, the RFC, which APUSH loves to ask about, and higher taxes to pay for it all. The RFC, by the way, it is worth defining real fast. It's a federal agency established under Hoover, obviously, in 1932 to promote economic recovery, provide emergency financing for banks, life insurance companies, railroads, and farm mortgage associations. It was continued and expanded as part of the New Deal. After it was first passed, it was really slow to take effect, and its funds were really slow to come out. It was a very cautious sort of agency. We're going to see FDR acting a lot more quickly and a lot more decisively. Congress responded in 1932 with the Glass-Steagall Act, which encouraged lending, and the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which allowed homeowners to remortgage their homes at lower rates and payments. Hoover intended the RFC to be the major tool to fight the Depression by pumping money into the economy. Created in 1932, several years after the beginning of the credit crunch that was producing economic paralysis, the RFC used federal funds to provide loans to banks, railroads, and large corporations to prevent their collapse and expand their operations. Hoover and his advisors hoped this funding would trickle down to workers and the unemployed through higher wages and new jobs. But the RFC came years too late, and it was really slow to begin operations. It did loan over $8 million within its first 5 months, but with little apparent effect on the economy. Critics branded it welfare for the rich and insisted Hoover do something for the poor and unemployed. Hoover opposed federal unemployment relief, however, believing that it was too expensive, and he also thought that it was likely to erode the work ethic. He is not a fan of quote unquote direct handouts to people in need. He would rather help secure them a job and an economic future where they're working to support themselves and their families, and FDR is going to share a lot of that philosophy. But as unemployment reached nearly 25% and pressure mounted from Congress and the public, he accepted an emergency relief division within the RFC to provide $300 million in loans to states to pay for work relief. Yet few states wanted to put themselves more deeply in debt by borrowing, and 90% of the relief fund was still intact by the end of 1932. In the end, the RFC proved to be too little, too late to resolve the economic crisis. The onslaught of the Depression changed Hoover's and the nation's fortunes. Many Americans blamed the president and the Republicans for the worsening economy and for the callousness toward the hardships besettling the country. As people who lost their homes began to live in shanty towns on the outskirts of cities, the head of the publicity for the Democratic National Committee sarcastically dubbed them Hoovervilles, and the name stuck. Besides, for Hoovervilles, you've also got Hoover blankets, which are pieces of newspaper, and Hoover soup, which is ketchup mixed with water. A rising tide of discontent. Some farmers began to take matters into their own hands. In October of 1931, when an Iowa bank foreclosed on a mortgage and held an auction of the farmers' land and equipment, other farmers used their numbers and threats of violence to force a penny auction that returned the foreclosed farm to its owner for a fraction of its value. Penny auctions quickly spread across the Midwest. In Ohio, for example, one farmer, backed by a crowd of angry neighbors, regained his farm for a high bid of $1.90 to settle a mortgage of $800. In the summer of 1932, some Midwestern farmers joined the Farmers' Holiday Association led by Milo Reno. Reno urged farmers to stay home, buy nothing, sell nothing, and push up prices by destroying their crops rather than selling them. Many farmers responded by withholding their own produce from market and also setting up roadblocks to prevent other farmers from selling theirs. By 1932, Communist Party organizers were signing up members among desperate farmers. Farmers were not alone. Across the nation, strikes, protest rallies, bread marches, and rent riots took place as citizens demanded more jobs, higher wages, and relief payments. The Communist Party signed up nearly 20,000 new members between 1931 and 1932, although most dropped out after a short time. A major protest took place in the spring and summer of 1932 when thousands of World War I veterans, usually called the Bonus Army, converged on Washington, D.C. to demonstrate support for the Bonus Bill, which promised early payment of veterans' bonuses, originally scheduled for payment in 1945. These are veterans from World War I. Listen carefully to what happens here. The Bonus Army debacle is a huge thing in Hoover's presidency. The marchers, some with families, set up a Hooverville at Anacostia Flats, a marshy area along the Anacostia River about 2 miles away from the capital. When the bill failed, this bill that would have seen them get their bonuses paid early because they need money now, hello, the Depression and all that. When the bill failed, most left, but nearly 10,000 veterans stayed behind. In late July, Hoover ordered the Army to remove them. Led by Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur, troops armed with cavalry sabers, rifles, tear gas, and fixed bayonets evicted the veterans and their families and burned their shelters. Here he is using the Army against veterans. How do you think that's going to play out for him? About 100 veterans were injured and 2 were killed, but rumors quickly swelled at those numbers and intensified the public's angry reaction. Upon hearing of the Army's action, the governor of New York, Franklin D. Roosevelt, exclaimed, "This will elect me." And he was right. The Roosevelt landslide. Nearly any Democratic candidate could have defeated Hoover in 1932, but the Democrats nominated an exceptional politician, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, born into wealth and educated at the exclusive Groton School and Harvard College. After graduation with a recognizable name, Roosevelt entered New York politics. Tall, handsome, charming, and an accomplished public speaker, he became Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a position that his distant cousin Theodore Roosevelt once held in the Wilson administration, then won the Democratic nomination for vice president in 1920. Although he and presidential candidate James Cox lost, his political future looked bright. Then in 1921, he was stricken with polio and paralyzed from the waist down. Greatly aided by his wife Eleanor, he kept his political career alive and in 1928 won the governorship of New York. Roosevelt was one of the few governors to mobilize the state's limited resources to help the unemployed and the poor. Although results were modest, his efforts suggested a caring and energetic leader, a champion of the forgotten man. The opposite image stuck to Hoover, who seemed to have little concern for the 11 million unemployed Americans. When nominated for president in 1932, Roosevelt broke with precedent and flew to Chicago to give his acceptance speech to the convention himself. Establishing a theme for the coming campaign, Roosevelt emphatically announced that he and the Democratic Party had no fear of breaking with all foolish traditions, and closed by promising a new deal for the American people. The media quickly picked up the term, and Roosevelt's campaign acquired a memorable slogan, the New Deal. Although his speech offered no concrete solutions to the nation's problems, it promised hope, and it instilled the belief that Roosevelt would move the nation along a new path. During the campaign, Roosevelt largely avoided any commitments or policy proposals that might offend voters. He supported direct federal relief while promising to balance the budget, but mostly he stressed hope and the prospect of change. Hoover claimed that the campaign was more than a contest between 2 men, that it was a contest between 2 philosophies of government. The electorate chose the philosophy of Roosevelt and the Democratic Party. Across the nation, people voted for Democrats at every level, from local to national. Roosevelt won in a landslide with 57% of the vote to 40% for Hoover, who carried only 6 states. A deeper understanding of history, finding new archival sources. In 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved, and most property of the Communist Party, CP, of the Soviet Union passed into the hands of the new Russian Federation. One result was the opening to Western historians of archival collections that had long been closed to them. One of the most important for historians of the US is the former Central Party Archive located in Moscow, which in 1992 became the Russian Center for the Preservation and Study of Documents of Recent History. And then in 1999 became the Russian State Archive for Social and Political History. That second long name, RGASP, contains the largest single collection of archival materials dealing with the Communist Party of the United States for the years between the early 1920s and the late 1930s. During those years, CPUSA sent many of its documents, sometimes originals and sometimes copies, to Moscow, where they were saved in the archives of the Communist International, Comintern. Before these archives were opened, American historians who studied the CP had to rely on other sources. Before the opening of this archive in 1992, two different accounts of the CPUSA during the 1930s had developed. One focused on its leadership and on its domination by the Soviet Union, and the other focused on the local activities of CPUSA members. The first group of historians depicted the CPUSA as a puppet of Moscow, unquestioningly doing the bidding of Joseph Stalin, the dictatorial ruler of the Soviet Union. The latter group of historians emphasized the important activities of CP members in organizing rent strikes in Harlem, defending African Americans in Alabama, and helping to build some CIO unions. How did American historians react to the opening of these important new archival sources, and did American historians' understanding of the CPUSA change as a result? Surprisingly few rushed to Moscow, which in the early 1990s was still not an easy place to live and do research. But those who did trek to Moscow found an incredibly rich archive for the CP between the early 1920s and the late 1930s. Some of the earlier researchers, notably John Haynes and Harvey Clare, focused on the leadership of the CPUSA and its relation to the Soviet Union. They found that the leadership of the American Communist Party did the bidding of the Comintern and that some of them were involved in espionage. Among other researchers, Robert Chernai used the extensive files from local CP organizations in California and found that CP members there sometimes argued with directives from the national leadership, sometimes ignored them, and were sometimes disciplined for that, and played an important role in some union organizing and briefly in state politics. Randy Storch, who studied Chicago using materials from the first archive center, found CP members actively involved in efforts to halt evictions, secure relief for the unemployed, and organize workers and students, sometimes succeeding despite the rigid directives from party headquarters in New York. Vernon Peterson, who studied Maryland, found the state CP there to be divided and ineffectual, but also found that CP members used their influence to benefit the Soviet Union and that a few CP members were involved in espionage. So in the end, the new archival sources did not greatly change what historians had previously concluded about the CP, but they did unearth a great deal more complexity and richness than had previously been the case. Wouldn't that be a fun archive to dive into? The New Deal. Considering the questions, how did the New Deal change the role of the federal government? How did various groups respond to the New Deal measures? And what happened to restrict expansion of the New Deal after 1936? Like the elections of 1860 and 1896, the election of 1932 was one of the great turning points in American political history. Since 1860, Republicans had usually been able to win the White House, and after 1896, they usually controlled both houses of Congress. The GOP, meaning Grand Old Party, and that is a nickname for the Republican Party if you didn't know, the GOP, the Republicans, had set the agenda for national politics. After 1932, however, Democrats, under the leadership of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, created bold new policies and established themselves as the majority party for a generation. 1933, the first 100 days. In the 4 months between the election and Inauguration Day, the economy worsened as Americans eagerly awaited for the New Deal Roosevelt had promised. Many expected that Roosevelt and his advisors, labeled by the press as the Brains Trust because the group included several college professors, were developing a plan to restore prosperity. In fact, Roosevelt's advisors were frequently at odds about which path to follow, meaning they disagreed. Some, especially Rexford Tugwell and Raymond Moley, supported a collective approach, working with business through joint economic planning. Others, notably Francis Perkins, Harry Hopkins, and Eleanor Roosevelt, advocated social programs. All agreed that the worst path was doing nothing. Roosevelt took office on March 4th, as many banks seemed on the verge of closing. Millions listened to the inauguration on the radios and heard the president promise that the economy would revive and reassured them that they had nothing to fear but fear itself. We must act quickly, he specified, adding that he would call Congress into emergency session to deal with the banking crisis. On March 6th, Roosevelt, soon widely referred to just as FDR, his initials, declared a national bank holiday, closing all banks. 3 days later, as freshman congressmen were still finding their seats, the president presented Congress with the emergency banking bill. Without even seeing a written version of the bill, Democrats and Republicans took less than 4 hours to give Roosevelt exactly what he wanted. The new law required a federal inspection before banks could reopen, thus reassuring depositors that those that reopened could be trusted, and it allowed the Federal Reserve and the RFC, held over from the Hoover administration, to prop up the nation's banking system by providing funds and buying stocks of some banks. On Sunday evening, March 12th, Roosevelt took to the radio in the first of his fireside chats. Definitely know the fireside chats, guys. In these fireside chats, he reassured the nation that the federal government was solving the banking crisis and that banks would be safe again, adding, "It is safer to keep your money in a reopened bank than under the mattress." The banks reopened the next day. Over 60 million Americans listened to the speech, and most believed him. In Atlanta, for example, deposits on March 13th outnumbered withdrawals by 3-1. Within a month, nearly 75% of the nation's banks were operating again. The New Deal was underway. Riding a wave of popular support and great expectations, Roosevelt faced a unique political climate of almost total bipartisanship. Bipartisanship, by the way, is when two major parties work together cooperatively. Some Republicans also embraced aspects of the New Deal. Within its first 100 days, referring, of course, to the opening period of Roosevelt's administration, during which President and Congress developed an unprecedented number of measures aimed at relief for the unemployed and economic recovery. Basically, the first 100 days of his presidency, it's why we still care about the first 100 days of people's presidencies. Within its first 100 days, the Roosevelt administration and Congress created a long list of new federal agencies and programs. A few carried out traditional Democratic Party goals, such as the repeal of prohibition, but most were aimed at the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. As we launch really into Roosevelt's presidency, I would highly recommend that you use flashcards. This is a wonderful flashcard chapter. They're not beneath anybody. They are wonderful study tools, and you can arrange them and study with them, and it'll help you understand how everything fits together. I highly recommend that you use flashcards here. Roosevelt requested, and Congress quickly passed, the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, the first thing that maybe needs to go on a note card for you, unless you want to go back and get, a couple other things, bank holiday, emergency banking bill, stuff like that. Glass-Steagall Act might be a good one too. So the AAA intended to help agriculture recover. A new agency, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, was created to pay farmers to reduce production as a way of cutting the surpluses that drove down prices for farm produce. Focusing on wheat, cotton, corn, rice, tobacco, hogs, and dairy products, a planning board determined the amount to be removed from production. They're trying to raise prices by lowering the amount of foodstuffs and agricultural products available, right? All this was to be paid for by a special tax on industrial food processors. Some critics argued that the AAA gave too much power to the government. Others complained that it did nothing to help small farmers, sharecroppers, and tenant farmers, or to make surplus food available for the needy. With the AAA beginning to address the problems of agriculture, the Roosevelt administration next turned to industrial recovery. The National Industrial Recovery Act, NIRA, was approved in June, with Roosevelt calling it the most important and far-reaching legislation passed by the American Congress. The act was a compromise between two different approaches put forth by Roosevelt's advisors. It incorporated both approaches by creating two new agencies. First, the National Recovery Administration, the NRA, and second, the Public Works Administration, the PWA. Are you starting to see why this is also called the alphabet soup era? The NRA, led by Hugh Johnson, a former Army general, was intended to restart the economy through national economic planning. It set out industry by industry to establish codes that set prices, production levels, and wages. Businesses supported the NRA because it allowed price fixing, which raised both prices and profits. Labor was attracted by Section 7A, which gave workers the right to organize unions and to bargain collectively, outlawed child labor, and established minimum wages and maximum hours of work. By early 1935, some 700 industries with 2.5 million workers were displaying a poster with a blue eagle that meant they were covered by NRA codes. The PWA took a different approach. Remember, this is the second half here of the NIRA. The PWA stimulated recovery by funding major construction projects, thereby directly providing jobs for construction workers and more jobs in the industries that supplied construction materials. These jobs would then stimulate demand for consumer products and create still more jobs. The PWA was by far the largest federal public works program up to that time, and it still ranks as one of the largest ever. Administered by the Department of the Interior, the PWA was slow to begin operations, partly because the projects required significant planning and partly because the Secretary of the Interior, Honest Harold Ickes, was scrupulous about preventing waste or graft. Still, over 6 years, the PWA spent some $6 billion, equivalent to about $100 billion today, usually in cooperation with state and local governments, funding some 34,000 projects, including roads, bridges, giant electricity generating dams, 70% of all new school buildings, 1/3 of all new hospital buildings, 2 aircraft carriers, and much more. One of the most innovative programs of the first 100 days was the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, created to develop a regional approach to planning and development for a rural and impoverished region of 40,000 square miles, including parts of 7 states. There's a map of the TVA, by the way, on 609 that would be really good for you to take a look at here during this section. The most immediate benefit was jobs repairing and building dams and improving flood controls, but the TVA did much more. The TVA improved the navigability of hundreds of miles of waterways and reduced soil erosion. Its dams provided electricity through federally owned and operated hydroelectric systems, making possible the introduction of electricity to many rural areas. The TVA also provided a model for other federal dam building projects, especially in the West, that provided water and electricity for economic development. Critics of the New Deal opposed such government-owned agencies as socialist, and that'll be a criticism levied against many of these programs, so keep an eye out for that. Recovery was one thrust of Roosevelt's offensive against the Depression. He had campaigned on the slogan of helping the forgotten man. And in March of 1933, unemployment was at a historic high, 25% of the workforce. In industrial states such as New York, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Illinois, unemployment pushed toward 33% and was even higher in some manufacturing centers. Recognizing that state and private relief sources could not cope with people's needs, Roosevelt proposed and Congress enacted federal relief programs. Though all were temporary measures, they established a new role for the federal government. By the end of the decade, about 46 million people had received some form of relief support. The first relief program was the Civilian Conservation Corps, or the CCC, passed on March 31st, 1933. It established several thousand Army-style camps to house, employ, and provide a healthy moral environment for unemployed urban males ages 18 to 25. Within months, it enrolled over 300,000 men, paying them $30 a month, $25 of which was sent back to their parents. That way, the money would have a ripple effect. By 1941, more than 3 million men had received employment through the CCC camps. The Conservation Army built and improved national park facilities, constructed roads and fire breaks, worked to control erosion, dug irrigation ditches, fought forest fires, and planted trees. In the camps, 35,000 men were taught to read. The CCC reached only a small percentage of those needing relief. To widen the range of assistance, the Roosevelt administration created the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or FERA, F-E-R-A. FERA provided states with money for their relief needs, mostly for work relief. In some cases, it bypassed state and local governments and instituted federally administered programs. One such FERA program opened special centers to provide housing, meals, and medical care for many of the homeless roaming the nation. In the program's first year of operation, it cared for as many as 5 million people. We thought we'd gone to heaven, one man recalled years later of his experience at a transient camp where he was deloused and given a bath, a bed, and food. In other programs, 500,000 people attended literacy classes and 1 million received vaccinations and immunizations. The Civil Works Administration, the CWA, was a temporary measure to help the unemployed through the winter of 1933 to 34 by hiring 4 million jobless people for federal, state, and local work projects. The goal of the program was to provide work to as many unemployed people as possible, and CWA projects did result in many permanent public works. Kind of a tongue twister there. The list of new programs approved during the 100 days did not end there. The Homeowners Loaning Corporation, HOLC, established in May 1933, permitted homeowners to refinance their mortgages at lower interest rates through the federal government. Before it stopped making loans in 1936, the HOLC refinanced 1 million homes, 20% of all mortgaged urban homes. To correct problems within banking, the Banking Act of 1933 extended the authority of the Federal Reserve System and created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, which I mentioned earlier, which provided federal insurance for those who deposited money in member banks. In less than 6 months, 97% of all commercial banks had joined the system. The Banking Act of 1933, known as the Glass-Steagall Act, also separated commercial banking from investment banking, meaning that banks that accepted individual deposits and offered individual checking accounts could no longer sell stocks, bonds, and other securities. Basically, they're trying to make sure that banks aren't taking really stupid gambles with people's money. The special session, the first session of the 73rd Congress, met for 102 days, but this period quickly became known simply as the 100 days. Never before had Congress passed so much major legislation in so short a time. Since 1933, journalists have popularized the notion of judging a new president on the accomplishments of the first 100 days in office, and an activist president is always compared to FDR. However, such comparisons rarely take into account the seriousness of the crisis facing the nation in 1933 or the unusual degree of bipartisanship that characterized the 100 days. Basically, it's not fair to compare the people to FDR because of, the historical context when he was assuming office, and also the willingness of Republicans and Democrats at the time to work together. 1934, year of turmoil. The New Deal started with almost total support in Congress and among the people. However, as the economy began to improve, opposition emerged. By mid-1933, most Republicans and some conservative Democrats opposed relief programs, increased federal spending, and increased regulation of business. A few new policies were approved in 1934, notably creation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, or the SEC, to regulate stock markets, and the National Housing Act, which set up the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, to make home loans more available. Also in 1934, conservative Democrats, including Al Smith, the 1928 presidential candidate, joined with representatives of several major corporations to establish the American Liberty League, which opposed New Deal policies through an extensive media campaign funded mostly by the DuPont family and other corporate leaders. Conservatives fumed that Roosevelt threatened free enterprise, if not capitalism itself. The Hearst newspaper chain instructed its editors to tell the public that the New Deal was a raw deal and that Roosevelt was leading the nation into socialism. The Communist Party, meanwhile, stridently attacked the New Deal as a tool of big business and charged that FDR was pushing the nation toward fascism. By late 1934, communists claimed 25,000 members and 6,000 youth members. Half of the members were unemployed, but the communists also claimed an additional 50,000 followers in communist-controlled unions and organizations of the unemployed. A major target of anti-New Dealers on both the right and the left was the NRA. Critics soon dubbed it the National Runaround. Some businesses resisted the restrictions and regulations of NRA codes and questioned the government's right to impose such controls. Consumers grumbled that the NRA pushed prices up without any noticeable growth in wages or jobs. Farmers griped that the NRA generated price increases ate up any AAA benefits they received. Workers complained that NRA codes set wages too low and hours too long, and that employers resisted unionization. One woman textile worker wrote to the president that her husband was laid off for no other reason than they got a union here, and my husband became president of it. The NRA's Section 7A set off a nationwide organizing drive by unions, but organizing drives and subsequent strikes often met stubborn resistance from employers and local officials. Between July 1st and the end of 1933 alone, the American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, counted 15 strikers killed, 200 injured, and hundreds arrested, along with a half dozen deployments of National Guard troops. Labor's rights to meet, organize, and strike had been widely violated, the ACLU concluded, and added that the NRA lacked the will or the power to overcome the defiance of employers. Further violence came in 1934 as hundreds of thousands of workers walked picket lines and nearly 2,000 strikes in almost every city. 30,000 cab drivers shut down New York City's taxis in late July and most of February. Between January and early May, more than 80,000 coal miners walked out in a half dozen strikes in 9 states. Nearly 40,000 auto workers struck, sometimes only for a day, at 9 plants in 4 states. Several 100,000 textile workers walked out in 6 states, the largest of all the strikes in 1934, but they failed to gain union recognition. Nearly 22,000 longshore and maritime workers were more successful after tying up shipping on the entire Pacific coast for 3 months. A strike by Minneapolis Teamsters eventually gained union recognition and led to the first organization of over-the-road drivers, truckers driving between cities. In some places, notably San Francisco and Minneapolis, there were brief general strikes when all the city's unions stopped work to protest the killing of strikers. Communists or other Marxists were also prominent in some of these strikes. By 1934, too, several figures were attracting significant attention by arguing that the New Deal had not gone far enough. At 3 o'clock every Sunday afternoon, Father Charles Coughlin, a Roman Catholic priest, used the radio to preach to nearly 30 million listeners. Formerly a supporter of Roosevelt, the radio priest turned against the New Deal and advocated a guaranteed annual income, the redistribution of wealth, tougher anti-monopoly laws, and the nationalization of banking. His attacks on Roosevelt also began to carry anti-Semitic, meaning anti-Jewish, overtones. His organization, the National Union for Social Justice, claimed 5 million members. Huey Long, a flamboyant senator from Louisiana, also known as the Kingfisher, proposed a dramatic Share Our Wealth plan. According to his plan, every family would receive an annual check for $2,000, a home, a car, a radio, and a college education for each child, all to be funded by taxing the rich, including confiscating all income over $1 million. Share Our Wealth Society signed up over 4 million members throughout the country. Dr. Francis Townsend advocated an old age pension plan to provide every American ages 60 and older with a monthly pension check for $200. To qualify, individuals could not work and they had to spend the money within a month. Thousands of Townsend clubs sprang up with an estimated membership of several million, including 60 members of Congress. Upton Sinclair, the socialist who had exposed the unsanitary conditions in meatpacking with his 1905 novel *The Jungle*, won the Democratic nomination for governor of California in 1934, arguing for a program that he called End Poverty in California, or EPIC. EPIC proposed to take over idle factories and farmland for use by the unemployed. When Sinclair lost the election, he broadened his EPIC program to end poverty in civilization and sought to build a national movement. So there we have some people who think that the New Deal doesn't go far enough, who are critics of FDR, not because they think he's doing too much, but because they don't think he's doing enough. Father Charles Coughlin, Huey Long, Francis Townsend, Upton Sinclair, definitely be aware of his critics on the left, FDR's critics on the left. Amid this turbulence, the first real measure of voter sentiment came in the 1934 state and congressional elections. Democrats had a one-vote majority in the House of Representatives after the 1930 elections, and Roosevelt's landslide victory in 1932 boosted them to a 313 to 117 majority. Most politicians and journalists expected the 1934 congressional elections to follow the usual off-year pattern in which the president's party lost seats. In 1934, however, Democrats made further gains, now outnumbering Republicans by 320 to 103 in the House and 60 to 35 in the Senate. Roosevelt, it seemed, was immensely popular despite all the criticism from the right and the left. In the wider world, the Spanish Civil War. Just as the Depression brought forth a range of new political movements in the US, so too did the economic crisis spawn new movements and political turmoil elsewhere. In Spain, a republic had been established in 1931, but the election in 1936 of a People's Front government led to civil war when an army general, Francisco Franco, you might know his name from your study of World War II, combined much of the army with support from the Catholic Church and great landowners in an effort to restore the monarchy. The Republican government created an army, but also relied on assistance from abroad, especially when Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy began to assist Franco. The Soviet Union supplied assistance to the Republican government, as did many volunteers from abroad, who were organized into the international brigades. About 1,000 American volunteers, mostly Union members and communists, were organized into the George Washington and Abraham Lincoln battalions. Support for the Spanish Republican government became a major cause for American leftists between 1936 and 1939, when Franco's forces defeated the last supporters of the Republic, initiating a dictatorship that lasted until Franco's death in 1975. One example of how art interprets history can also be found in Pablo Picasso's Guernica, Guernica. If you Google even Spanish Civil War, Picasso, you'll see it and you'll immediately recognize it. I know you've seen it before. 1935, the second 100 days. During the early months of 1935, the huge Democratic majorities in Congress produced little new legislation, and FDR provided little leadership beyond asking Congress to provide more work relief. Months later, Congress responded, allocating nearly $5 billion for relief and creating a new agency, the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. Harry Hopkins, a former social worker whom FDR put in charge of the WPA, set out to put the unemployed to work. WPA programs are discussed later in this chapter. Beyond WPA, Roosevelt seemed uncertain where to turn next. He was anxiously watching Huey Long and the Supreme Court. He considered Huey Long dangerous because of his contempt for democracy in Louisiana, where he completely controlled state politics, and his demagogic appeals for national support. If Long were to run as a third-party candidate in 1936 and unite the supporters of Coughlin, Townsend, and Sinclair, he might win the presidency or at least throw the election to a Republican. The Supreme Court also made FDR anxious because New Deal programs were coming under challenge for their constitutionality. On May 27, 1935, in Schechter Poultry Corporation of the United States, the Supreme Court ruled that the NRA was unconstitutional because it improperly delegated legislative authority to the executive branch, and it exceeded congressional authority to regulate interstate commerce. Roosevelt furiously exclaimed that the court still had a horse and buggy mentality. Roosevelt then moved into action, calling on Congress to pass several pieces of legislation. Members of Congress had been planning to go home and avoid the steamy Washington summer, but now stayed in session and over the next 3 months passed some of the most significant legislation of the 20th century. The establishment of a federal old age and survivor insurance program set the tone of the second 100 days and significantly modified the government's role in society. Frances Perkins was the driving force behind the Social Security Act 1935. She had been working on the bill since early 1933. With Roosevelt's full support now, it moved toward passage. The Act's most controversial element was a pension plan for retirees aged 65 or older. The program was to begin in 1937, and initial benefits were to vary depending on how much an individual paid into the system. Compared to Perkins's original plan or to existing European systems, the Social Security system was limited and conservative. It failed to cover domestic and agricultural laborers, and it provided no health insurance. Roosevelt insisted that workers should pay for their pensions. We put those payroll contributions there so as to give the contributors a legal, moral, and political right to collect their pensions and unemployment benefits. With those taxes in there, no damn politician can ever scrap my Social Security program. The new Social Security program provided not only old age pensions, but also federal aid to families with dependent children and to people with disabilities, and it helped to fund state-run programs of unemployment compensation. Within 2 years, every state was paying between $15 and $18 a week in unemployment compensation and supplying support to over 28 million people. The Social Security Act established a major new function for the federal government and is one of the most durable legacies of the New Deal. You've all got Social Security cards. That's how big of a lasting deal this is, and Social Security numbers. Since its inception, amendments have changed the method of payments, instituted cost of living increases, and added medical coverage. Millions of Americans have benefited from this system. The next bill that Roosevelt called on Congress to approve was the National Labor Relations Act, or the NLRA. Largely the work of Senator Robert Wagner of New York and called the Wagner Act, it put the power of government behind workers' right to organize and to bargain collectively with their employers over the terms and conditions of their employment. It created the National Labor Relations Board as a new regulatory agency to oversee labor regulations and ensure workers' rights, including their right to conduct elections to determine union representation and to prevent unfair labor practices such as firing or blacklisting workers for union activities. Although the act excluded workers in agriculture and service industries, the Wagner Act significantly altered the relationships among business, labor, and the government, and in a very real way, redistributed economic power from employers to unions. Definitely know the Wagner Act. The final bill that Roosevelt pushed was a revision of income tax rates for those making over $50,000 a year, equivalent to about $845,000 a year today. Often called the Wealth Tax Act, it was intended to increase federal revenues to pay for such new programs as the WPA. Taken together with the WPA, the Wealth Tax Act provided the first significant example of a federal redistributive policy, taxing the wealthy to provide work relief for the unemployed. Social Security also had some modestly redistributive features. Since 1935, a modest level of redistribution has been a continuing feature of federal economic policy. The election of 1936 and the waning of the New Deal, waning meaning to get smaller. By the end of 1935, Roosevelt had reasserted his leadership. The chances of a successful Republican or third-party challenge to the president were remote. Republicans nominated Alfred Landon of Kansas, one of the few Republican governors reelected in 1934. As governor, he had accepted and used most New Deal programs, but in keeping with the party wishes, he attacked Roosevelt and the New Deal as destroying the values of America. After the death of Huey Long in 1935, Townsend and Coughlin formed a third party, the Union Party, but they posed no threat to Roosevelt's reelection. Roosevelt reminded voters of the New Deal's achievements and denounced big business as greedy. Roosevelt won with the largest percentage of the vote up to that time. Landon carried Maine and Vermont. I'm not even sure if he carried his home state of Kansas. The Democratic victory demonstrated not only the personal appeal of Roosevelt, but also an acceptance of an activist government that could provide social and economic benefits. Roosevelt's second inaugural address raised expectations of a third 100 days. I see millions of families trying to live on income so meager that the pall of family disaster hangs over them day by day, he announced. I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-clad, ill-nourished. The words seem to promise new legislation aimed at helping the poor and the working class. A third 100 days failed to materialize. Instead of promoting new social legislation, Roosevelt first took on the Supreme Court. His anger with the court had been growing since the court had invalidated the NRA and later the AAA. As 1937 began, constitutional challenges to the TVA, the Wagner Act, and Social Security were all on their way to the court. Further, there had been not a single vacancy on the court during Roosevelt's first term, a highly unusual occurrence. Fearing that the court was determined to undo the New Deal, Roosevelt proposed to enlarge the court from 9 to 15 judges. Arguing that the court's elderly judges were unable to keep up with their work, he asked Congress to authorize him to nominate an additional justice for everyone over the age of 70 who had served on the court for more than 10 years. His real objective was obvious to everybody. He wanted to be able to add enough justices to protect the New Deal from the court's conservative majority. Called the court-packing plan by its opponents, Roosevelt's proposal proved a major political miscalculation. It is very, very unpopular what he does, or what he tries to do. Several conservative Democrats, especially Southerners, saw an opportunity to break with the president. Roosevelt's support weakened further when enough justices changed sides that the court upheld the state's minimum wage law, the Wagner Act, and the Social Security system, something since called the Judicial Revolution of 1937. After Justice Willis Van Devanter, a conservative, announced his retirement, Roosevelt dropped his proposal and happily appointed Hugo Black, a New Deal senator from Alabama, to the court. Before he left office, Roosevelt had appointed every member of the court except for one. He is also president for much longer than anybody else. Another setback that snagged the Roosevelt agenda was a recession, dubbed Roosevelt's recession by critics. As the economy stabilized by 1937, industrial outputs reached their 1929 levels and unemployment fell to 14%. Secretary of the Treasury Henry Morgenthau urged Roosevelt to reduce government spending and move toward a more balanced budget. Roosevelt agreed and cut back relief programs, releasing nearly 1.5 million workers from the WPA. But the economy was not strong enough to cope with reduced government spending and thousands of people seeking jobs. At the same time, the new Social Security deductions slightly reduced the paychecks of most employed people, causing some people to cut back purchases. The recovery collapsed and unemployment soared back up to 19%. In April of 1938, Roosevelt restored spending, but the recession had tarnished his image of being able to manage recovery. But the fact that when he repeals this help, the economy starts to slide back indicates that, what he's doing is clearly assisting people and clearly helping the economy. It was not just the court packing plan and the recession that weakened the New Deal. Some wealthy Americans opposed the higher taxes approved in 1935. Labor strife during 1935 to 1938 increased concern about unions and their relation to the New Deal. The United Automobile Workers had occupied factories as part of a strike. Such sit-down strikes alienated many who considered them violations of property rights. The public's mood had changed. The American people, Hopkins observed, were now bored with the poor, the unemployed, and the insecure. Despite waning support, the administration passed two more significant pieces of legislation. In 1938, a second Agricultural Adjustment Act reestablished the principle of federally set quotas on specific commodities, acreage reduction, and subsidy payments. The Fair Labor Standards Act, also passed in 1938, addressed issues that the Francis Perkins had long championed. It established 44 hours, as the standard work week, set a minimum wage, which was 25 cents an hour at the time, and outlawed child labor under age 16. With its minimum wage provisions, the act was especially beneficial to unskilled and non-union workers and to workers from racial and ethnic minority groups. It was the last piece of New Deal legislation. In the 1938 congressional elections, Roosevelt failed to get New Deal supporters elected, and Republicans increased their numbers and influence in Congress. Conservative Democrats, mostly from the South, increasingly joined the Republicans in a conservative coalition able to derail new liberal programs. Roosevelt recognized political reality and asked for no new domestic programs. Though no more new legislation was forthcoming, the changes the New Deal generated remained part of the American social, economic, and political culture. By 1939, the economy was recovering, but unemployment and underemployment persisted. 8 million were still unemployed. Full recovery did not appear until 1942, when the United States mobilized for a Second World War. Wartime spending finally propelled the American economy out of the Depression and to new levels of prosperity. Going back toward a more perfect union, the Judicial Revolution of 1937. The Judicial Revolution of 1937 marked the end of 6 decades when the Supreme Court usually interpreted the Constitution as putting severe limits on the ability of federal or state governments to regulate economic activity. But the Judicial Revolution also marked a beginning. The U.S. v. Caroline Products 1938 decision involved the constitutionality of a 1923 law that regulated certain dairy products. The decision was by Justice Harlan Fiske Stone, who had been appointed to the court by President Coolidge. First, Stone found that such regulatory laws should be assumed to be constitutional unless they obviously violated the Constitution or were arbitrary or irrational. But he went further in footnote 4 to present an analysis that began to define the court's role for the next 50 years. In that famous footnote, Stone specified that the presumption of constitutionality should not apply in cases that involved the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, which prohibited federal restraints on rights, or the 14th Amendment, which prohibited states from putting restraints on rights, or in cases that involved prejudice against minorities. Such cases, he indicated, should be subjected to more exacting, so more judicial scrutiny. Over the following decades, the court did exactly that, significantly extending civil rights and protecting civil rights. Changing the face of America, the New Deal in action. Considering the questions, what were the major accomplishments of the PWA and the WPA? How did the Wagner Act change the status of organized labor? And how did the New Deal attempt to address the problems of agriculture? New Deal agencies touched the lives of a large majority of Americans and changed the U.S. in important ways. The activities of New Deal agencies were so widespread and various that it is possible to describe only the most prominent. PWA and WPA. The PWA was the New Deal's major stimulus project, intending to promote recovery by hiring private contractors to build a wide array of permanent public facilities. Transportation infrastructure, streets, highways, bridges, accounted for 1/3 of all PWA projects. Next in number came school buildings, about 1/5 of all PWA projects. The PWA also funded huge dams, notably the massive Grand Coulee Dam on the Columbia River, at the time the largest electrical power facility in the US, providing the foundation for economic development in that region. There were, in all, about 34,000 PWA projects, and they consumed about half of all concrete poured in the country between 1933 and 1943. I don't usually read the captions beneath photos, but I'm going to read the one here on 616. Some of the most visible legacies of the New Deal consist of the many public buildings and other public structures, from huge dams to city sidewalks, that were constructed by New Deal agencies. PWA structures were intended to be permanent, attractive additions to communities, and the large majority of them incorporated art. Many of the buildings were in an architectural style often now called the PWA Modern, which drew upon the Art Deco and streamlined modern styles of the period. This limestone bas-relief sculpture in the Art Deco style, presenting agriculture symbols, especially a woman sewing grain, forms the central decorative element for the Municipal Auditorium in Beatrice, a city of 11,000 people, according to the 1940 census, in southeastern Nebraska. The architect was Fred Organ, but the identity of the sculptor has not been established. The building was constructed between 1938 and 1940 using local and PWA funds and is now in the National Register of Historic Places. This bas-relief remains one of the most significant public sculptures in a several county area. The WPA was intended to provide work to over 2.1 million unemployed workers a year between 1935 and 1938. It did not duplicate the PWA. Only the unemployed were eligible for WPA jobs, unlike PWA projects, and WPA projects usually spent less on materials than did PWA projects. For many WPA projects, the WPA provided the wages and local governments paid for materials. WPA workers did manual labor building roads, schools, and other public facilities in partnership with local governments. The WPA sought to pay wages higher than relief payments, but lower than local wages. Wages for people of color and women were the exception, generally exceeding the local rate, so meaning they were basically higher than what they would get locally. The WPA also created jobs for professionals, writers, artists, actors, and actresses, and musicians. Unemployed historians, writers, and teachers conducted oral interviews, including sessions with nearly every living ex-slave, and wrote state and local histories and guidebooks. Theater groups and orchestras toured towns and cities performing Shakespeare and Beethoven. By 1939, an estimated 30 million people had watched a WPA production. Unemployed artists created art for public buildings. When some objected to actors, artists, and writers receiving aid, arguing that their labor was not real work, Hopkins bluntly responded, "Hell, they gotta eat just like other people." The writing, music, and art projects were usually focused on the American scene, and many of them brought new attention and understanding to regional differences. The WPA also reached out to women, members of racial and ethnic minority groups, students, and young adults. Prodded by Eleanor Roosevelt, the WPA employed between 300,000 and 400,000 women a year. Some were hired as teachers and nurses, but the majority, especially in rural areas, worked on sewing and canning projects. Efforts to ensure African-American employment met with success in the northeastern states, but were less successful in the South. The National Youth Administration, the NYA, created in 1935, developed programs to aid college and high school students and young people not in school. Mary McLeod Bethune, an African-American educator, directed NYA's Division of Negro Affairs. Through determination and constant, skillfully applied pressure, she obtained support for Black schools and colleges and increased the number of African Americans enrolled in vocational and recreational programs. Definitely know Mary McLeod Bethune. She's a huge figure in her past. The Wagner Act and the growth of organized labor. While the WPA was intended primarily for relief, the Wagner Act was a major reform. It came at a time when organized labor was at a crossroads. The unions that made up the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, had organized many skilled workers, but not those of the major mass production industries, steel, automobiles, rubber, textiles, and it generally avoided unskilled or less skilled workers. Some AFL unions limited their membership to whites or males only. John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers, Coal Miners, an industrial union that originated in the Knights of Labor, had insisted on the inclusion of Section 7A in the NRA and had used it to launch a successful organizing drive among coal miners. He argued that the AFL should organize the large mass production industries on an industrial model with one union for all workers in the industry, regardless of skill. That approach violated the longstanding AFL policy of separate unions for each skill group. When the AFL leaders turned Lewis down, in 1935, he formed the Committee on Industrial Organization, the CIO, within the AFL. Composed of several AFL affiliates committed to the industrial model, the CIO launched organizing drives in the automobile, steel, rubber, electrical equipment, and textile industries. The Wagner Act gave their efforts important federal support. Remember, the Wagner Act really supports the right of unions to exist and to collectively bargain. Most AFL craft unions opposed Lewis's efforts. After marking important victories in the automobile and steel industries in 1937, Lewis led the CIO unions out of the AFL in 1938. They formed the Congress of Industrial Organizations and began to charter new industrial unions. Some of the AFL unions, notably the carpenters, machinists, and teamsters, launched their own organizing drives, sometimes on an industrial model. Under the Wagner Act, unions nearly doubled their membership in 5 years, and the percentage of the private sector workforce in unions eventually reached an all-time high of 39% in 1958. The New Deal on agriculture. Like industrial workers, many farmers put their trust in Roosevelt and the New Deal. By 1935, the AAA appeared to be working as farm prices climbed and the purchasing power of farmers increased. But there's a cost. Tenant farmers and sharecroppers usually received no share of the AAA payments paid to their landlords and sometimes found themselves evicted from their farms, 1 million by the end of 1935, so that landlords could take the land out of production. Remember that many sharecroppers in the South are Black, they're people of color, and they've been relegated to these positions of economic, they're sort of economically underneath whites in the system that's set up in the aftermath of slavery. So just kind of have that context in mind. In 1936, in the United States v. Butler, the Supreme Court ruled that the AAA's production quotas and special tax on processing companies was unconstitutional. Quickly, the administration turned to other programs, including the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allocation Act, in order to reduce production. In 1938, Congress approved the Second Agricultural Adjustment Act that reestablished the principle of federal quotas on production, acreage reduction, and subsidies. By 1939, farm income had more than doubled since 1932, and the government had provided over $4.5 billion in aid to farmers. Since then, federal farm subsidies have continued and have significantly changed the relationship between agricultural producers and the federal government. Basically, the government has paid them to be less productive so that the fewer crops they create, the more valuable they are. Nature also helped take land out of production as drought devastated a 5-state region in the southern Great Plains. Above average rainfall previously had encouraged the extension of wheat farming, but in the early 1930s, reduced rainfall led to crop failure. The drought continued for several years, becoming the worst in U.S. history. High winds then created gigantic dust storms that stretched more than 200 miles across and over 7,000 feet high. A reporter labeled the region the Dust Bowl. Millions of tons of topsoil blew away, much of it all the way to the Atlantic Ocean. Beginning in 1937, New Deal programs planted trees and shelter belts across the drought-ravaged region and taught farmers new farming techniques, reducing wind erosion by 2/3. By the mid-1930s, thousands of farm families displaced by drought, technology depression, or the AAA headed for California, hoping to start over. Many of them found work as agricultural workers following the crops, picking peaches and peas, grapes and plums. Few Californians greeted them warmly, meaning they were not welcome. The LA police chief sent police units to the state border to encourage them to turn back. Usually denigrated as Okies, regardless of the state from which they came, they encountered miserable living conditions. Most migratory labor camps lacked even rudimentary sanitation, and most migratory labor families could not afford proper diets or healthcare. A survey of 1,000 migratory children in the San Joaquin Valley during 1936 to 37 found 831 with medical problems, most caused by malnutrition or poor hygiene. California's migratory farm workers benefited from the work of the Resettlement Administration, the RA, created by executive order in 1935. The RA tried to address rural poverty everywhere in the country: Western migrant farm workers, Southern sharecroppers, other impoverished farm families, by helping them establish new working lives and planned communities. The Resettlement Administration had just begun that work when it was absorbed by a new agency, the Farm Security Administration, the FSA, in 1937. In California, the RA and the FSA constructed a few migrant labor camps with adequate sanitation and housing. Nearly all rural Americans benefited from the Rural Electrification Administration, the REA, created in 1935. In that year, only 10.5% of farms had electricity. Considering rural areas unlikely to be profitable, companies had refused to extend electrical services to the countryside. The REA bypassed private utility companies by helping farmers to form rural electrical cooperatives. Within just 5 years, the REA had extended electrical service to 1 million farms. By 1950, 90% of farms were electrified. Electricity lessened the drudgery of farm life, giving families running water and access to a variety of electrical appliances. Within 8 months of receiving electricity, new consumers bought an average of $180 in appliances. The two most common were an electric iron and a radio. Electricity also improved rural education, health, and sanitation, encouraged greater diversification, and helped to introduce new industries. Americans grapple with the Depression. Considering the questions, how did Americans cope with the many challenges presented by the Great Depression? What opportunities arose for women, African Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, and Native Americans, and what challenges faced those groups during the 1930s? And how did the Depression and the New Deal affect cultural expression? The New Deal was able to establish new patterns of government responsibility, in part because the Depression touched every segment of American life. Basically, nobody was safe from the Depression. Poverty and hardship were no longer reserved for those viewed as unworthy or relegated to remote areas and inner cities. Now, poverty touched blue and white collar workers and even some who were once wealthy. Most Americans worried about their futures and economic insecurity, but the next day might bring a reduction in wages, the loss of a job, or the closing of a business. Making do. To help those facing economic insecurity, magazines and newspapers provided useful hints and depression recipes that stretched budgets and included information about nutrition. According to home economists, a careful shopper could feed a family of 5 on as little as $8, equivalent to $139 today a week. This was comforting news for those with that much to spend, but for many families and for relief agencies, $8 a week for food was simply beyond possibility. That was too much money. Before the New Deal, New York City provided only $2.39 a week for each family on relief, and San Francisco provided only a weekly box of groceries in return for a week's work. Things were bad, comedian Groucho Marx joked, when pigeons started feeding people in Central Park. By 1933, most towns and cities had little ability to provide more than the smallest amount of relief and struggled unsuccessfully to maintain basic city services. Experiencing a shrinking tax base, local, county, and state governments cut back or eliminated relief, and some laid off teachers, policemen, and other workers. Because state and local governments depended on property taxes, the New Deal indirectly provided assistance for local and state governments, as the HOLC and the FHA saved homes, stimulated some new construction, and thereby restored property tax bases. Federal agencies, especially the PWA and the WPA, not only provided many local civic improvements, schools, hospitals, governmental buildings, roads, and bridges, but also reduced the local relief responsibilities. Basically, it meant that locals didn't have to worry about providing so much. Other federal programs also helped to lessen the burdens of local and state governments. In North Dakota, for example, it was estimated that 2/3 of the people drew some form of federal assistance. Thus, the New Deal drastically altered the relationship between local and national government. Increasingly, people saw the national government as having an obligation to support families and communities against economic adversity. That's a very important idea. Use it up, wear it out, make it do or do without became the motto of most American families. In working class and middle class neighborhoods, making do meant that some homes sprouted signs announcing a variety of services: household beauty parlors, kitchen bakeries, rooms for boarders. I did baking at home, a Milwaukee woman recalled, adding, I got 9 cents for a loaf of bread and 25 cents for an apple cake. I cleared about $65 a month. A sewing machine salesman commented that he was selling more machines to people who did not previously do their own sewing. For farm families, feed sacks had long provided fabric for sewing, and companies now competed by printing attractive designs on their sacks. One woman remembered her mother making a new school dress from a sack that had a sky blue background with gorgeous mallard ducks on it. Still, even with making do, many families failed, first losing jobs and then homes. Some families moved in with relatives. One man remembered that most Depression-era households were like his, where father, mother, children, aunts, uncles, and grandma lived together. Approximately 1/6 of America's urban families doubled up. Many others loaded their meager possessions on their jalopies and traveled across the country looking for a better life. Some rode the rails, hitching rides in boxcars, living in Hoovervilles, begging and scrounging for food and supplies. Most American males had long expected that they would provide for their families, and many became despondent when they could not. A social worker remembered, I used to see men cry because they didn't have a job. Many people found their families and lives torn apart. Records show increased numbers of suicides, admissions to state mental hospitals, and children placed in orphanages. Despite the hardships, American society did not collapse as some had predicted. The vast majority of Americans clung to traditional social norms and even expanded family togetherness. Economic necessity kept families at home. They played cards and board games, read books and magazines, and tended vegetable and flower gardens. The game of Monopoly, in which players won by driving the other players into bankruptcy, zoomed to popularity. Church attendance rose and the number of divorces declined. Fewer people got married and the birth rate fell. Changing women's roles. As unemployment rose, more married women began to seek jobs, but some companies refused to hire married women. The proportion of married women in the professions declined from 14.2% to 12.3%, with teachers particularly vulnerable. A survey of 1,500 school districts found that 77% did not hire married women, and 63% fired women if they married. Nowadays, things like that are illegal. By 1932, 2 million women were out of work, and an estimated 145,000 women were homeless. But unemployment patterns were uneven. Women in low-paying and low-status jobs were less likely to be laid off and more likely to find employment. White women also took jobs traditionally held by African Americans, especially in domestic service, forcing them out of jobs. Few working women found that bringing home a paycheck changed their role within the family. Most husbands still expected to be head of the household, even if unemployed, and a few helped with household work because such work challenged their notions of masculinity. One husband helped with the laundry, but refused to hang the wash outside for fear that neighbors might see him doing it. At home, women renewed and reaffirmed traditional roles. They sewed, baked, bread, and canned fruits and vegetables. Even so, a woman's traditional role as mother continued to evolve. The birth rate continued to fall, as did family size, thus extending the patterns that were first seen in the 1920s. While some of this was due to couples agreeing that they could not afford children at the time, in other cases, it was due to decisions made by women alone. The declining size of families also resulted from the postponement of marriage because of finances. The older a couple is when they marry, the fewer children they're likely to have. Through it all, women were often praised as pillars of stability in a changing and perilous society. One woman remembered, I did what I had to do. I seemed to always find a way to make things work. So overall, then, women's status and role in the home doesn't really change during the Great Depression. Race and Depression, South and West. The Depression's economic impact intensified economic and social difficulties for African Americans, Latinos, and Asians who faced increased racial hostilities and demands that they give up their jobs to whites. Throughout much of the Southwest, Mexicans were accused of taking the bread out of our white children's mouths. Low-paying, frequently temporary jobs and high unemployment made life in Latino communities difficult. On farms in California, Mexican-American workers were being replaced by Anglos, including those fleeing the Dust Bowl. Those managing to find work in the fields earn only $289 a year, about a third of what the government estimated it took to maintain a subsistence budget. In the early 1930s, especially, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, worked with local authorities to facilitate repatriation of Mexican nationals to Mexico. Throughout the early 1930s, some local and state agencies gave free transportation to those willing to leave. In several cities, the INS conducted sweeps of Mexican-American communities to round up illegal immigrants for deportation and to scare others into leaving. In Los Angeles, such sweeps resulted in nearly 10,000 people boarding trains bound for Mexico. Such actions were not limited to the Southwest. One Indiana town denied relief to Mexicans and Mexican-Americans and encouraged them to board a train to Mexico. They aren't forcing you to leave, recalled one repatriado. They gave you a choice, starve or go back to Mexico. Nationally, more than 500,000 had left by 1937. There was no comparable effort to repatriate Asians living on the West Coast, but Asian immigrants and Asian Americans often received inadequate relief. In San Francisco, where nearly 1/6 of the Asian population qualified for benefits, they received 10 to 20% less than whites, probably because relief officials accepted the stereotype that Asians could subsist on a less expensive diet. Hoping to break down economic and social barriers, some Asians intensified efforts to assimilate, becoming 200% Americans. The Japanese American Citizens League was organized in 1929 to overcome discrimination and to oppose anti-Asian legislation, but by 1940, the group had made little headway. Stay tuned for World War II. Before 1929, African Americans working as sharecroppers, farmhands, and tenant farmers in the South were already experiencing depression conditions, earning only about $200 a year. Their lives worsened as farm prices continued to fall and as hard times and the AAA increased evictions during the Depression. Many left the farm for urban areas, seeking more economic security. Cities, whether South or North, provided few opportunities because whites were taking jobs that were previously held by African Americans. Joblessness among African Americans in urban areas averaged 20 to 50% higher than for whites. Compounding the high unemployment, across the nation, Blacks faced increasing racial hostility, violence, and intimidation. In 1931, the attention of the nation was drawn to Scottsboro, Alabama. Listen up here, folks. If you're sleepy, listen up. Scottsboro, Alabama, where 9 Black men and teenagers had been arrested and charged with raping 2 white prostitutes. Although no physical evidence linked the men and teenagers to the crime, a jury of white males did not question the testimony of the women and quickly found the so-called Scottsboro 9 guilty. 8 were sentenced to death. The 9th, a minor, escaped the death penalty. Through appeals, intervention by the Supreme Court, retrials, parole, and escape, all of those convicted were free by 1950. A New Deal for all? Like the Depression, the New Deal affected women and members of racial and ethnic minority groups in different ways, but generally it inspired the belief that the government cared. Eleanor Roosevelt was at the center of this image of compassion. She often acted as the social conscience of the administration and prodded her husband and other New Dealers to remember women and people of color. "I'm the agitator," she once said. "He's the politician." She crisscrossed the country, meeting and listening to people. She received thousands of letters describing people's hardships and asking for help. Although she could rarely provide direct assistance, her replies emphasized hope and pointed to the changes being made by the New Deal. Eleanor Roosevelt helped convene a special White House conference on the needs of women in 1933. She, Frances Perkins, and other female New Dealers worked to ensure that women received more than just token consideration from government agencies. Ellen Woodward, assistant director of the FERA and later the WPA, succeeded in promoting a few women's programs headed by women. Still, New Deal agencies frequently paid women less than men, and fewer women proportionately were enrolled in relief programs. Women accounted for about 10% of WPA workers, and the largest number were in programs focused on traditional women's skills like sewing. Social Security and the Fair Labor Standards Act both excluded domestic workers and similar service occupations with large proportions of women. Despite these shortcomings, the New Deal provided women with more programs and government positions than during any previous administration. For African Americans and Latinos, the Roosevelts and the New Deal provided a large amount of hope and a smaller amount of change. More African Americans than ever before were appointed to government positions. Mary Bethune organized African Americans and the administration into a Black cabinet that met in her home and became a semi-official advisory body on racial relations. Among the most pressing needs, the Black cabinet argued, was access to relief and jobs. The New Deal provided both, but never to the extent that they asked for or needed. Some New Deal administrators, notably Ickes and Hopkins, took steps to ensure that the PWA, WPA, and other New Deal agencies included members of racial and ethnic minority groups, especially African Americans. WPA and PWA administrators eliminated much discrimination from their programs in northern cities, but they had less success elsewhere, where skilled African American workers were often given menial minimum wage jobs. Other agencies were less supportive. The Civilian Conservation Corps and the Tennessee Valley Authority practiced racial segregation and wage discrimination. Still, by 1938, nearly 30% of African Americans were receiving some federal relief, with the WPA alone supporting almost 1 million African American families. But even that was not enough. In Cleveland, though 40% of PWA jobs were reserved for African Americans, Black unemployment and poverty remained higher than for whites. FDR also refused to support civil rights legislation. When confronted by Black leaders over his refusal to back an anti-lynching law, Roosevelt explained, "If I came out for the anti-lynching bill now, they," meaning powerful Southern Democrats, "will block every bill I ask Congress to pass. I just can't take that risk." Eleanor Roosevelt took more risks and visibly supported equality for racial and ethnic minority groups. In 1939, when the Daughters of the American Revolution refused to allow Marian Anderson, a renowned Black singer, to perform at their concert hall in Washington, the First Lady resigned her membership and, with assistance from Ickes, arranged a public concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Anderson's performance there attracted more than 75,000 people. Latinos benefited from the New Deal in much the same way as African Americans. In New Mexico and other Western states, the Depression curtailed, meaning it cut short, much of the migratory farm work for Mexican-American workers, devastating local economies. New Deal agencies such as the CCC, PWA, and WPA provided welcome jobs and income. Throughout the Southwest, federal agencies not only included Mexican-Americans, but also sometimes paid wages that exceeded, meaning it was more than what they received in the private sector. Discrimination, however, was still widespread, often enhanced by language differences. New Deal legislation helped union organizers trying to assist Latino workers throughout the West. The United Cannery, Agricultural, Packing, and Allied Workers of America, UCA-PAWA, chartered by the CIO in 1937, included Latinos and Latinas among its organizers. Despite some success organizing Mexican women working in California canneries, efforts to organize federal field workers, came up against strong opposition from local growers, backed by some of the most powerful corporations in the West. UCA-PAWA organizers, notably Luisa Moreno, were also active in creating El Congreso de Pueblos de Habla Española, the National Spanish-Speaking Congress, can't believe that I just pronounced all that right, which in 1939 brought together a wide range of Latino organizations around a civil rights agenda. Despite its limitations, the New Deal provided hope and support for many women and members of racial and ethnic minority groups, who in turn praised Roosevelt. The WPA came along and Roosevelt came to be a god, said one African-American. You worked, you got a paycheck, and you had some dignity. Where they could vote, many members of racial and ethnic minority groups now began to vote for Roosevelt and the Democratic Party, which is wild because remember which political party was with which side in the Civil War? In the 1936 presidential election, Roosevelt carried every Black ward in Cleveland and nationally received nearly 90% of the Black vote. By 1939, the Democratic Party was providing a political vehicle for the aspirations of industrial workers, people of color, and farmers. So if you've been wondering where the sort of switch-ish on some issues between the parties is going to happen, here's really where it starts. Native Americans directly benefited from the New Deal. They had two strong supporters in Secretary of the Interior Ickes and Commissioner of Indian Affairs John Collier. Both opposed existing Indian policies that since 1887 had sought to destroy the reservation system and eradicate Indian cultures, talking there about the Dawes Act. At Collier's urging, Congress passed the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. Designed to restore tribal sovereignty under federal authority, the act returned land and community control to tribal organizations, permitted Indian self-rule on a reservation if reservation residents so decided, and ended the allocation of reservation lands in severalty. Each tribe had to ratify the act to participate, and not all tribes did so. 77 rejected the changes, including the Navajos, the nation's largest tribe, although some of those who initially rejected the act later changed their decision. To improve conditions on reservations and to provide jobs, Collier organized a CCC-type agency for Indians and ensured that other New Deal agencies played a part in improving Indian lands and providing jobs. Working with tribal leaders, Collier took measures to protect, preserve, and encourage Indian customs, languages, religions, and folkways. Reservation school curricula incorporated Indian languages and customs, and Native Americans could once more openly and freely exercise their religions. Nonetheless, the so-called Indian New Deal did little to improve the standard of living for most American Indians. Funding was too little, and the problems created by years of poverty and government neglect were too great. Some tribal leaders complained that Collier's programs had been drafted with little or no participation by Indians themselves. At best, the program slowed a long-standing economic decline and allowed Native Americans to regain some control over their cultures and their societies. Cultural expression in the midst of depression. There's a photo on this page, by the way, that you've got to take a look at. Migrant mother. Absolutely be sure that you look at that picture and read the caption down there below. The homogenization of culture that began in the 1920s due to the movies and radio continued in the 1930s. At the same time, however, there were significant changes in cultural expression. During the 1920s, many American writers and artists rejected their consumer-oriented society, producing novels depicting hedonism or escapism, discussed in the previous chapter. Many writers in the 1930s changed that focus, portraying instead working people and their problems or looking for inspiration to figures in American history. Many artists turned to a more realistic style. A generation of painters, some of whom produced works of social criticism during the 1930s, was influenced by Diego Rivera, a great Mexican muralist who also produced murals in San Francisco and Detroit. Other Depression-era artists, particularly those in the Federal Arts Project, FAP, of the WPA, depicted the lives of ordinary people or themes from American history, sometimes drawing upon local or regional history. By one count, FAP artists produced some 200,000 individual works of art, murals, paintings, and sculptures, nearly all intended for public display. Prominent novels during the 1930s depicted inequities caused by capitalism, racism, and class differences. John Steinbeck defined the social protest novel of the time. Among his early works, Tortilla Flat portrayed the lives of Mexican Californians, and In Dubious Battle presented an apple picker's strike through the eyes of an idealistic young communist.
The Grapes of Wrath, 1939, which won the Pulitzer Prize for the best novel of the year, presented the Joad family who lost their farm in Oklahoma and migrated to California, where their family disintegrated under the strain of life as migratory farm workers. Steinbeck received the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1962. Similar social criticism appeared in Erskine Caldwell's Tobacco Road about Georgia sharecroppers, and Richard Wright's Native Son, a critique of racism that became the first Book of the Month Club selection by an African-American author. Ernest Hemingway's For Whom the Bell Tolls depicted an American fighting against fascism in the Spanish Civil War, in sharp contrast to the hedonism of his The Sun Also Rises. Dorothea Lange is the subject of, well, not the subject, but the photographer behind the photo there in 627. I'm going to read the caption underneath that photo before I return to the text. Dorothea Lange's photograph, Migrant Mother, is one of the most famous in the history of photography. Her first caption was, "Destitute pea pickers in California, a 32-year-old mother of 7 children, February 1936. Lange later recalled taking her famous picture. "I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. She said they'd been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children had killed. She had just sold the tires from her car to buy food." Lange's subject was Florence Owens Thompson, born in Oklahoma of Cherokee Indian descent. She and her husband came to California in the late 1920s and worked as farm laborers, traveling the state picking fruit and vegetables. Her daughter, the 4-year-old child on the left, later remembered her as a hardworking disciplinarian who loved red dresses and country music, drank Lucky Lager beer, and chewed Garrett snuff tobacco. It's also worth noting that Florence Thompson didn't know that she was the subject of this photo that sort of became the face of suffering in the New Deal for decades. And when she found out, she was not happy because she did not want to be the face of suffering. She didn't want to be the face of need, which I understand. Dorothea Lange began photographing the victims of the Depression in the early 1930s and continued that work with the RA and the FSA. She ranks among the leading figures in creating the new genre of documentary photography. Her 1936 photograph of a migratory farm worker and her children, later entitled Migrant Mother, emerged as the most famous and perhaps the most moving photograph of the era. Margaret Burke Blight joined Lange as a pioneer in documentary photography with dramatic photographs of the Fort Peck Dam and moving shots of the victims of the Depression. As in the 1920s, movies remained popular, providing a welcome break from the woes of the Depression. On a national average, 60% of the people saw a movie a week. In the 1920s, some films had glorified gangsters or reveled in the sexuality of such stars as Clara Bow. To head off pressure for federal regulations to prevent such films, the major studios in 1930 created the Motion Picture Production Code, which specified, among other things, that the sympathy of the audience should never be thrown to the side of crime, wrongdoing, evil, or sin. So basically, they're going to make movies where the good guys actually are good. Many studio heads now insisted that the public needed escapist entertainment to distract them from the Depression. Musical extravaganzas like 42nd Street and Gold Diggers of 1933 fit the bill, as did the slapstick comedy of the Marx Brothers, whose Duck Soup is ranked among the best films of all time. Some disdain for the wealthy could be found in popular comedies that contrasted members of a snobby and selfish upper class with the honesty and common sense of ordinary people. Some Westerns and gangster films were equally escapist, but others probed more deeply into the human condition. Stagecoach, directed by John Ford, so defined the Western genre that it inspired imitators for years after. Frank Capra directed several films that sympathized with the problems of ordinary people. Mr. Smith Goes to Washington showed a naive but honest ordinary citizen battling political corruption. Hollywood occasionally produced films of social criticism, notably an adaptation of The Grapes of Wrath starring Henry Fonda. Charlie Chaplin's leftist politics were apparent in 2 major works, Modern Times, portraying the dehumanizing tendencies of technology, and The Great Dictator, which mocked and criticized Adolf Hitler. That's, by the way, from 1940. Radio also provided an escape from everyday economic woes. Nearly 90% of American households included a radio, suggesting that listening to the radio was nearly universal. Gloom chasers, that is, comedians, including Jack Benny and the comedy teams of George Burns and Gracie Allen and Fibber McGee and Molly, filled the radio airwaves. Crime fighters were popular on the radio and also in newspaper comic strips and comic books, where Dick Tracy, Superman, and Batman protected innocent victims from harm and oppression. The Great Depression and New Deal in perspective. Considering the one question, how did the Great Depression and the New Deal affect Americans over the long run? A depression, a contraction of the economy causing significant unemployment and lasting several years, was nothing new. Americans had experienced serious depressions every 30 to 40 years since the 1930s. For generations, mothers had advised daughters to save up for hard times. The Great Depression confirmed that wisdom and left its mark on a generation. For those who lived through the 1930s, making do became not just a way of surviving the depression, but a way of life that many continued long after the economy revived. The New Deal also left its mark on a generation. Some spent the rest of their lives criticizing Roosevelt for destroying free enterprise. Others proudly voted Democratic because the New Deal had helped their families to survive. Democrats had been the minority from the election of Lincoln in 1860 until the election of Roosevelt in 1932. Thereafter, Democrats usually won the presidency until 1968, and they usually controlled Congress until 1994. But the New Deal Democratic coalition was inherently unstable, including union members and small-scale farmers, Southern white supremacists and African Americans in northern and western cities, former socialists, and states' rights conservatives. The New Deal left was the permanent legacy of a more activist federal government and a limited welfare state, increased regulation of business, Social Security, the Wagner Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and more. For the next 60 years, no prominent politician questioned the appropriateness of a federal program benefiting the elderly or a federally defined minimum wage. Most Americans came to expect that the federal government should take prompt action to prevent depressions, reduce unemployment, and assist those most in need. Since Roosevelt, Americans have expected presidents rather than Congress to be the chief policymakers. In all these ways and more, the Great Depression and New Deal changed how Americans think about themselves and what they expect from their government. Individual voices, Francis Perkins explains the Social Security Act. On September 2, 1935, Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins spoke over the radio to explain the importance of the recently passed Social Security Act. As the Social Security bill was being drafted and considered by Congress, it had come under attack from the right and the left. Conservatives argued that the bill imposed big government into an area best served by private and individual efforts. Liberals objected that it was not inclusive enough, leaving out large segments of the workforce and providing no health benefits. Because Perkins' speech gave many Americans their first explanation of how the new act would change their lives, historians find it important information about both the thinking of New Deal policymakers and about the ways that the Roosevelt administration wanted people to understand this new program. People who work for a living in the United States can join with all other good citizens in satisfaction that the Congress has passed the Social Security Act. It provides for old age pensions, which mark great progress over the measures upon which we've hitherto depended in caring for those who've been unable to provide for the years when they can no longer work. It also provides security for dependent and crippled children, mothers, and the indigent, disabled, and the blind. Old age benefits in the form of monthly payments are to be paid to individuals who have worked and contributed to the insurance fund in direct proportion to the total wages earned by such individuals in the course of their employment, subsequent to 1936. The minimum monthly payment is to be $10, the maximum $85. These payments will begin the year 1942 and will be to those who have worked and contributed. Because of difficulty of administration, not all employments are covered in the plan at this time, but it is sufficiently broad to cover all normally employed industrial workers. It is a sound and reasonable plan. It does not represent a complete solution to the problems of economic security, but it does represent a substantial, necessary beginning. This is truly legislation in the interest of the national welfare. Its enactment into law would not only carry us a long way toward the goal of economic security for the individual, but also a long way toward the promotion and stabilization of mass purchasing power, without which the present economic system cannot endure. The passage of this act, with so much intelligent public support, is deeply significant of the progress which the American people have made in using cooperation through government to overcome social hazards against which the individual alone is inadequate. Basically, we can all come together and use the government to help those who are less fortunate and those who are, at the end of their maybe earning careers, we'll say. Summary. The Great Depression brought about significant changes in American life, altering expectations of government, society, and the economy. When Hoover assumed the presidency, most believed the economy and quality of life would continue to improve. They thought the party of the 1920s would not stop. The Depression changed that. Flaws in the economy were suddenly exposed as the stock market crashed, banks and businesses closed, unemployment soared, and people lost their homes and their hopes for the future. More than previous presidents, Hoover expanded the role of the federal government to meet the crisis. However, Hoover's measures, including the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, failed to stimulate a worsening economy. Losing faith in Hoover, most Americans put their trust in Roosevelt and his promise of a New Deal. Roosevelt easily won the 1932 presidential election and took office amid widespread expectations for a major shift in the role of government. The first 100 days witnessed a barrage of legislation, most dealing with the immediate problems of unemployment and economic collapse. The Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Recovery Administration were designed to bring economic recovery, while the Civilian Conservation Corps and Public Works Administration were intended both to relieve unemployment and to stimulate the economy. In 1935, assailed by both liberals and conservatives, Roosevelt responded with a second burst of legislation that focused more on putting people to work, economic redistribution, and social legislation, especially Social Security. The overwhelming Democratic victory in 1936 confirmed Roosevelt's popularity. But FDR's ill-conceived court-packing plan, an economic downturn, the Roosevelt Recession, labor unrest, and growing conservatism generated opposition to new legislation, and the New Deal wound down after 1938. The Depression affected all Americans as they had to adjust their values and lifestyles to meet the economic and psychological crisis. Lives were disrupted, homes and businesses lost, but most people learned to cope with the Great Depression and hope for better times. Gender roles were affected by the Depression as men lost their jobs. Members of racial and ethnic minority groups carried the extra burdens of discrimination, sometimes by New Deal agencies. New Deal programs touched the lives of many Americans, from unemployed laborers to unemployed artists, from struggling farmers to industrial workers. During the 1930s, for the first time, the federal government provided significant support to artists, writers, and musicians. While movies and radio often provided escape from daily worries, other forms of cultural expression focused on the problems faced by ordinary people. The New Deal never fully restored the economy, but it engineered a profound shift in the nature of government and in society's expectations about the federal government's role in people's lives. Basically, Americans came to expect that the federal government would be there to help them if hard times were to hit again.